Hey guys, this week we are looking at chapters 4 and 5. So you'll notice in your readings, you're only responsible for the last section of chapter 4, which talks about political awakenings. You are more than welcome to read all of chapter 4 to get a better understanding of what was happening. Chapter 4 goes into a little bit of detail about like witchcraft and religion, religious awakenings. It kind of sets the stage that way. But I really, since this is a short course, I really just want to look at that last section about political awakenings. So that's what we're going to talk about in this mini lesson. And then, of course, chapter 5, you are responsible for all of chapter 5 because there's just really great content and it sets the stage that will lead us into chapter 6, which talks about the American Revolution. So when we are looking at political awakenings, you can see here kind of what we're doing. We're going to look at how colonists began pushing back against authority even before the revolution. You'll see how everyday conflicts over government prices, land, and liberty helped build a culture of resistance. And here are the learning objectives I have for you. This is what we're going to briefly go over. And then also just some key terms. This will help you in understanding if you know what these terms are and you know these definitions because it's brought up in the book and then also just me talking a little bit about it. So let's jump right into it. So when we think about political awakening in American history, a lot of us will often jump straight to the American Revolution. But several decades, long time, like we are looking at early on, like even back to the 1600s, the American Revolution really doesn't take place until we start seeing that happening around 1773, 1774. But long before independence, colonists were already questioning authority, they were testing power, and they were organizing resistance. And in the 18th century, colonists lived under British rule, but the reality of power was a lot more complicated than that. So changing those political relations, as the colonies grew, local government became a lot more complex. Most colonial officials were really wealthy men who held power at the local level, so like within their town, within their colony, right? However, ultimate authority over laws, war, and peace, that kind of those big things, that remained with the king and parliament. And distance in this case really matters when you have an entire ocean between the people that you're trying to rule. So because Britain is an ocean away, it was nearly impossible for Parliament to tightly control colonial life. And royal officials understood this and often compromised with local colonists. So institutions like town meetings in Massachusetts and the House of Burgesses in Virginia gave colonists some control over their daily affairs. And this is that House of Burgesses. This is just like a meeting place where they met. This is the actual meeting place in Virginia. But then think of the House of Burgesses kind of like Congress or Parliament. Like it's smaller, obviously, but it's just a gathering, a meeting of men. So at the same time, colonial society operated on a tradition known as deference. Sorry, my pronunciation you're going to find is not very good with some like words with a lot of vowels. So don't worry, I mispronounce things all the time. It's okay for you to do the same. And what that means is that most people are expected to accept the authority of elites, right? And elections existed, but political power remained concentrated among wealthy property-owning men. So still, this way of ruling is not absolute. Over time, religious ideas from the Great Awakening encouraged people to really begin to question authority, because with the Great Awakening, we find that poor people were invited, where it wasn't just, oh, only the wealthy people get to sit at the front. During the Great Awakening, really brought religion to everyone for the first time in colonial history. And so those religious challenges really started to merge with political frustrations, and as a result, resistance became more common and more acceptable. Then you get into dissent and protests, and colonial protests had a long history, but after the 1730s, it expanded dramatically, and more people participated. More people, like women, the poor, and African Americans, increasingly engaged in protests. And their targets often included those royal officials, local authorities, wealthy merchants, and landlords. And there was this growing belief began to emerge that rights were not limited to rich people, right? Everyone has rights. Everyone should have liberties. And economic pressure played a major role in that. During economic downturns, who suffers the most? It's usually the poor. And so we start to see women leading these bread riots to protest rising food prices because they're the ones in charge of putting food on the table for their family. They attacked grain warehouses and retail shops, and while these riots temporarily reduced prices, they did not solve long-term economic problems. Still, they demonstrated the power of collective action, right? Farmers also protested in places like Boston. Plans to build a public market favor large producers and it hurt small farmers. So when legal appeals failed, those protesters burned market stalls in the night. And though the market was rebuilt, the message was clear. Ordinary people were willing to challenge direct authority. So let's look at the land conflict and community resistance. So conflicts over land intensified. Right? In New York and New Jersey, tenants protested landlords and land speculators who claimed large amounts of land. And when petitions failed, protesters burned those buildings, they attacked livestock, and they looted property. And they formed their own communities, courts, and militias. And local militias failed to stop the unrest because many militia members were participating in the protest themselves. So in port cities, another issue sparked resistance, and that's impressment. British officials forcefully enlisted sailors into the Royal Navy. Basically, they kidnapped men, young men especially, but they would go and kidnap men to serve in the Navy. Life aboard naval ships was brutal. There's high rates of illness and death, and so it's kind of like a death sentence if you were kidnapped and forced into service. And in 1747, Boston erupted into riots that lasted for 3 days. And although impressment is going to continue, even after we are a nation, we're going to see Americans being impressed into the British Navy. So although that has continued, colonists had made their position clear. They would not passively accept violations of their liberty. And political awakening also reshaped urban politics. In cities like New York, cross-class alliances emerged. So you're wealthy, you're poor, kind of coming together. And elites sought the support of artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers. And some non-elite men gained the right to vote and even hold office. Because a lot of times you had to own property in order to vote, or you had to own a business in order to vote. And we're going to see some of those restrictions going away, and ordinary white men are going to be allowed to vote. In 1733, Lewis Morris is going to challenge Governor William Cosby. Morris presented himself as a defender of the common man against corrupt royal officials. While working with class support, he won an election, and his supporters launched the New York Weekly Journal, and it was published by a guy named John Peter Zenger. And Zenger accused the governor of corruption and election fraud, and he is arrested for seditious libel. And if you don't know what seditious libel is, let's look at it really quickly because this is so important. Publishing materials seen as undermining government authority, even if they are true, even though Governor Cosby it was proven that he was being, that he was committing voter fraud and corruption. All that was proven, and even though it's true, you can't publish material against it, against him or against the government at the time. And so any criticism of the government, that's considered libel, even though it's true. So at trial, they're going to take Zenger to trial for publishing these true stories because it undermines government authority. And at trial, Zenger's attorney argued that truth should be a defense. And guess what? The jury agreed. Zenger was acquitted. Though British law did not change, the verdict revealed something critical. Colonial juries were willing to side with fellow colonists against imperial authority. So by the mid-18th century, colonists were already practicing resistance. They protested economic injustice, they challenged political authority, they formed cross-class alliances, and these political awakenings, it didn't cause the American Revolution, but it made it possible. And colonists were learning step by step how to imagine and defend their own power. So stay tuned for chapter 5. It's going to be a separate video, but those two combined, that's what I want you to work on this week when you get to the mini lecture and the discussion.